Changxu, Spring Grievance. Scare away the yellow orioles. Make them stop singing up in the branches. When they sing, it ruins a wife's dreaming. Only dreams can take her west of the Liao. So, we continue with the pentasyllabic quatrains, and this one is by the authorship of Changxu. Now, even more than with Li Pin, the poet we talked about yesterday, even less is known about Changxu. So, this is his only preserved poem. From the point of view of how well represented vis-a-vis his complete preserved works a poet is, and in relation to how many of those poems are in this anthology, you could say that he is the best represented poet, as 100% of his surviving works are in this anthology. But, well, as I said, not much is known of him, only that he was from Yuhan. No dates appear in the notes to this anthology, so not a major figure. The poem, Spring Grievance. Now, we've encountered a lot of poems that are like this, that voice complaints in spring. These complaints are generally placed in the voice of a female poetic persona who is languishing because her husband or lover is far away on official business or otherwise. But anyway, that beloved person is far away from home. So the spring becomes doubly poignant when the beloved one is away, because remember, in Chinese traditional thought there is this connection between man and nature, and the cycles of man and the cycles of nature. And spring, for example, is associated with a whole series of things: the color green, the eastern direction, the dragon, certain plants and animals and other things. And of course, very typically, the element wood. But of course, spring universally is the time in Western and Eastern tradition of renewal and love. So when a woman in spring is away from her lover, she is in a way, she feels in a way that time is out of joint for her, because it's the time of love, but love is denied to her. And then there's always this element also on the divergence between the perennially cyclic cycles of nature as opposed to the linear cycle of an individual human. That is, spring comes every year for nature, but human spring, that is one's youth, does not last forever, and it doesn't renew itself. And another characteristic of Chinese poetry is the natural background, as more than a background. That is, that would probably be too excessive a statement to say. But most nature poetry, if not all of it, in Chinese poetry is never landscape poetry as such. The landscape is meant to mirror, reflect, comment on, contrast with the feelings of the poet. Very often it's an externalization of the interior feelings of the poet. But anyway, we're getting too generally speculative and metaphysical. So this poem is about a spring grievance. A woman is complaining, or rather, it's not actually a woman who is complaining. The poetic voice is an omniscient narrator who knows about this woman who is far away from her beloved. And it's that man, well, man or woman, it doesn't matter, but it's probably the male voice of Jin Changshu. That man in the poem complains against bird singing. This is a trope we have encountered previously, I think, in some poems here, complaining that birds are singing because they wake you up. So even though the bird singing is one of the beautiful highlights of spring, here it's presented as a negative thing because it wakes you up. And what's so good of sleeping? Well, that's another stereotype, another topic that we've encountered in poems in this collection. The bad thing about waking up is that the woman who's sleeping was dreaming about her beloved husband who is far away, and the chittering of the birds has woken up the woman from her dream and separated her from her beloved. So this is, as I said, a very typical conceit. I think we've encountered in the anthology at least once, if not more than once, and it's a pretty common trope in Chinese poetry, a paradoxical image of the best of spring becomes bad, just as spring becomes bad, because, of separation. And in this case, the separation produced by the breaking of a dream. Okay, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So the first couplet really presents us the paradoxical ambiguity. Birds, stop singing. Don't sing, birds. Why would anyone want the lovely wobble of the orioles to cease? Scare away the yellow orioles. Make them stop singing up in the branches. So the poem begins with two imperative orders which have the same meaning, which are shoo away the birds, make them be silent. These birds are orioles, yellow orioles. I imagine they're typical harbingers of spring in China. For me, and I don't know if perhaps for the reader of this anthology, the image of yellow orioles nevertheless brings with it a certain dark and threatening undertone, because yellow orioles also appeared in one of the poems of the Book of Odes, the classic, the Shi Jing, one of the airs of Qin. And in that poem, the yellow orioles are associated with men that are going to be human sacrifices, to be butchered in the tomb of Duke Mu of Qin after the Duke has perished, has died. So there is an undercurrent for me, at least, when I'm reading this poem, of ominousness at the yellow orioles. They might be beautiful yellow birds, singing beautifully in spring, but, there are dark connotations behind them. But anyway, continuing the poem. So the first couplet says, stop these birds from chattering, stop these birds from singing. Obviously, the poetic reader of this anthology, or the person who hears these verses, would automatically think, why should the birds be quiet? The second couplet clarifies why. When they sing, it ruins a wife's dreaming. Only dreams can take her west of the Liao. So the topic we mentioned, I think we saw in a poem by Li Bai and in other poems by other poets, that there's this belief in China that in traditional China, that while you're sleeping, your soul can rip off, get away from your body, and make the long distance to a beloved person, which doesn't have to be your wife or husband, it can be a friend. And the soul starts that long, perilous, tough journey to encounter the beloved person. So we might imagine that is the context being imagined here. The woman's soul has left her body and traveled a long distance to where her husband is. And the wobbling of the birds severes, cuts off the dream, and brings her soul back to her body and away from the company of her beloved. We get an indication of what her beloved might be doing and where he is. Only dreams can take her west of the Liao. Now, the Liao is a river that was in the northeastern frontier of ancient China. It tended to mark for most of Chinese imperial history the frontier with the barbarians. To the east of it, a little bit to the east of it, you get the Korean peninsula, and to the north the areas of Manchuria, which, again, as I said, for most of Chinese history were barbarian lands. So her husband is west of the Liao, probably in a military garrison serving in that frontier area, and we don't know for how long, but this gives the poem another secondary but significant element as evoking frontier poetry, the poetry at the frontier. The husband is away fighting the emperor's wars, and again, this is a very common conceit since the first anthology of Chinese poetry. And this makes the spring less likable than it would be. So, pretty conventional piece, but I think it's decently composed and arranged.